So a basic assumption of modernity is that it deals with reality as it is. But the science of the last century has somewhat thrown the definition of reality into flux. These most basic scientific questions perhaps have even more widespread implications for academia than we have yet appreciated. If we, on some level, participate in creating the world that we experience, how might we reevaluate the realness of worldviews from the distant past? And how might a shift in these perceptions alter the way the modern world works? Fortunately for me, to answer these questions, I have Professor Greg Anderson of Ohio State University's Department of History. And I've probably to some degree already mistakenly represented what it is that your work deals with. So I'll just throw it straight to you and perhaps do so by asking a question. So if the real world, as you seem to argue in your work, as described by ancient people, was as objectively real to them as ours is to us, when we say the worlds of, for example, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians were also real, in what sense do you mean that? We should probably start by doing some pretty specific defining.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam, and it's very nice to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me. Clearly, if we're going to seriously consider the possibility that humans have actually lived in many different worlds of experience, we have to somewhat alter our sense of what we mean by a world or by a reality. Of course, in the modern world, we tend to take it for granted that reality is something that is more or less fixed, given, ruled by these unchanging, universal, timeless laws of science and nature. In other words, the reality is essentially a physical, material order out there, in which can be therefore objectively understood by us. And this, of course, is exactly what scientists have been trying to do ever since the so-called scientific revolution of the 16th, 17th centuries. And obviously that work continues. We still get dramatic new findings and discoveries, things like the Higgs boson and so forth, apparently somewhat altering and adjusting our sense of what the sort of essences and foundations of reality actually are. But all this is on the assumption that reality is something, as it were, that exists independently of us and our minds and our knowledge. That is, it is this objective reality. And when you look at recent debates that have been going on in the humanities and the social sciences, which of course I'm sure would be instantly dismissed by the world's physicists, what they are considering and have been in some ways, you could say for 100 years or more, is actually, as you put it before, that humans do in some way participate in what we could call the production of realities. In other words, the way that, and this is to generalize enormously, but the general proposition here would be that reality is not something that's fixed, given, material there that exists independent of our minds, but that reality is something of a process, a continuous process in which the human minds, whether we like it or not, are definitely, distinctly involved. And moreover, more recent currents that are moving in this general direction towards thinking of reality as something plural rather than singular are more inclined to question the modern assumption that humans monopolize things like consciousness, agency, and so forth. They are more ready to assign the possibility of a certain kinds of agency, if you broaden the definition of what agency is for far enough, to non-human phenomena, whether we're talking about animals or even things that like rivers and climate systems and so forth. why do we automatically exclude the possibility that these things have a certain kind of agency? I mean, at some level, it's pretty obvious they do have a certain kind of agency, but because they don't look like human beings, we tend to not take that seriously as real agency, which we tend to think humans monopolize. And this is all part of the human-centeredness of our modern way of thinking about reality. It's humans according to conventional modern thought, monopolize things like agency, consciousness, reason. We alone have, rights to life, liberty, and property, and so forth. And so hence, we in a way authorize ourselves to be the determiners of what is and is not real. Because if you think about it, the definition of what's real, according to conventional scientific understandings, is that it's something that must independently exist independently of the human mind, with its own properties, etc., as a phenomenon which the human mind can objectively understand. But if you think about it, that does still give humans the capacity, the right to determine what is and is not real. So whether whether we like it or not, human minds are involved in this whole business, even though science likes to think that what it's doing is merely kind of describing ultimately what's out there as if it exists independent of us. It's still making up its mind whether what's out there is really independent of our mind. In other words, where does the subjective human mind end and where does the objective reality begin?
So if I can jump in there.
Yes.
So I was going to ask, how did this fundamentally scientific question or series of questions find its way into your work as a historian?
Well, because when one does history, one is basically equipped with a certain set of tools for analyzing the experiences of the peoples of the past. And typically those tools, the ones most commonly used, were originally designed by modern social scientists. And those tools are essentially based on the modern social scientific analysis of modern societies. And so hence, the way we, even if you're studying ancient China or ancient Egypt, the way you naturally think about how what a human community is and what it consists of is already in a way pre-shaped for you by these modern social scientific tools. In other words, when you first analyze some historical world, let's say, your instincts are, first of all, to separate the human part of that world from the non-human part of that world, to sort of isolate the civilization, the culture, to focus on the cities, the art, the architecture, the thought, etc., separating that from all the non-human parts. And then when you focus in on the human parts, you're inclined to, first of all, separate the sacred from the secular. So you shove aside the stuff that relates to religion, which there's always going to be that in every non-modern world that you ever study. And you separate from that the secular stuff, which is what we would call political, economic, social, so family life, the way the rules are made, the way the rules are enforced, how people basically support themselves, the sources of their livelihoods. So you end up sort of breaking it all down and putting it in these little boxes, these little compartments called economy, called religion, called government or politics, called society. And the problem with doing all of that is that those kinds of compartmentalizations of experience exist only in a modern historical setting. So in other words, when you try to apply all of these categories to some non-modern world, including the ancient Greeks, who are the people I've been trained to study originally. I trained originally as a classicist, that you don't find any, as it were, corresponding evidence for those categories in antiquity at all. They're simply not there. Now, this doesn't stop the modern historians who study ancient Greece from still using those categories, because they just assume really those categories are always there as in experience. It's always going to make sense to separate the social from the political, from the economic, from the religious, and so forth. So they sort of assume it's sort of lingering there, even if it's not actually visible in the actual evidence of the lived experience of the people you're studying. In any case, so my own experience of studying this stuff, I was constantly confounded by and frustrated by this way of talking about the ancient Greeks. It's like, why are we imposing this kind of model of experience on them when it doesn't apply to them, never mind to the ancient Chinese or any other, non-Western peoples we might want to study? It doesn't even apply to the Western peoples we study. So, we're sort of assuming this story of a Western civilization where there are these continuities of experience between the Greeks, the Romans, and ourselves. And yet there don't seem to be you study their world, and it would actually make no sense for them to separate their social lives, as it were, from their political lives, or to separate their economic lives from their political lives. And it's not that all of these things are mixed up together, it's that none of these things are there in the first place. Their world is based on completely different principles from our own. And those principles relate to their fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality, what's really there in experience. And so when it comes to their decisions that they make, like, how are we going to actually, and what are we staking our lives here? What practices are we going to follow in our world to make sure we're still here tomorrow and our world will still be there? The decisions they make have nothing to do with things like separating the economic from the political or the sacred from the secular. In their world, the gods control all the conditions of their existence. So the most important practices you need are not like, let's found a democracy, which of course is the biggest preoccupation for most modern people who study the ancient Greeks, is the great democracy of the ancient Athenians. Sorry, but that isn't the most important thing about their world. The most important thing about their world is their relations with the gods, because the gods control all the conditions of existence. And that's why the average Athenian spent far more time engaged in what we would call religious activities, ritual activities. These activities literally go on like all the time, everywhere, on all different scales, from individual families having their own little cult practices, little ceremonies, all the way up to neighborhoods. Kinship groups have their own rituals, all the way up to the level of the Athenian polis as a whole, where we have our major festivals for Athena, for Zeus, and so forth. And these things continue year after year on predictable cycles. This is how their sort of calendar of life is structured. And of course, a lot of those festivals are tied into what we would call, the natural life cycles of plants and animals and so forth, harvests. Where these festivals are for a particular god, the god who is associated with, or we could say controls, the fertility of crops and so forth. So at certain points in the year, like say when you're harvesting, you have a festival to give thanks for the harvest. Of course you do. And you're giving thanks to a particular agency, to a particular god. So if you live in that world where your whole life is structured at a very deep level, like your, annual existence is sort of structured by participating not just maybe in the farming activities, which include all the harvesting, but also the ritual activities, which include maintaining relations with the gods who are, as it were, securing that harvest for you, granting you this harvest. You start to see their world very differently. You start to see that it's based, it's that you can't separate a sacred from a secular in that world, because what we would call economic matters of like productivity of the fields, if you like, is very much, the gods are ultimately shaping the conditions for all of that. So we should, I think of their ritual activities not as something religious or sacred that's totally separate from the secular things they do. We should see it as fundamental ecological activity. Like, these rituals are ensuring that our world is, that we are still able to live from 1 week, 1 month, 1 year to the next, because we are provided with all of the basic sustenance that we need. And then you start to step back and see the big picture of Greek society. Let's say the particular gods, these the Olympian gods like Zeus, Athena, and so forth, they are, we can say that they've been present in the world of the Greeks, let's say, since roughly probably around 2000 or just before BC, when the Indo-Europeans arrived, from that time on. And from 2000 BC all the way up to, let's say, 400 AD, when this worship of these gods is outlawed by Roman emperors who are insisting that Christianity is the exclusive religion. So we're talking about 2,500 years of this particular practice, this set of practices. And it seems to me that their world actually worked at a very basic level. We might look at it as primitive, religious, superstitious sensibilities, and so what really worked was the human labor, and then do some kind of economic analysis which explains how they were able to live. But that's not how they experienced it at all. And so if they were successfully able to, as it were, operate this world of theirs on their terms, and it succeeded in, as they, as it were, in the terms that they hoped and expected it would, for more or less 2,500 years, and only ended up changing because it was forced to by some external force, namely Roman emperors. How can we not say that that is its own world of experience? I mean, it succeeded as such. And moreover, it didn't cause absolutely catastrophic damage to the fabrics of our planet in the way that our modern world has done in just 300 years, when all of these ideas of, our kind of secular, disenchanted way of thinking about the world have taken over, and we have a whole different way of thinking about how humans relate to one another, how humans relate to non-humans, etc., etc. And we can go in more into that if you want to talk about how our own modern world has, in fact, unique, as it were, presuppositions about what reality is made of. They are not found anywhere else in historical experience at all. And I would say it's not coincidental that we only start to see truly catastrophic damage to the fabrics of our planet in the time that this modern style reality has been, as it were, unleashed on the world by Europeans since the age of colonization.
Well, I was just trying to think of, like, as a way of trying to play devil's advocate, when you're talking about the life of the ancient Athenians revolving around their relationship with the gods. Well, someone today would probably immediately jump on that and say, but they might have believed in them. It's a very difficult thing to talk about in a meaningful way. I suppose probably someone like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins might say something like, these people were the ancient equivalent of modern flat earthers, people who believe in ghosts, people who believe in alien abductions, and they might have totally believed in what they did, but it was still wrong. How would you?
They no doubt would say that.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose you could respond to that in two ways. One is that, at least from my perspective, people like, let's say, the hardline secularist types like Richard Dawkins, the ones who rubbish religion. Well, you know what? There's no great achievement in doing that when you already inhabit our modern disenchanted secular reality, because even people in our modern world who consider themselves religious do not stake their lives literally on the workings of divinities in the way that ancient peoples did. So let's be clear about the difference between, let's say, your typical, Anglican in England or Roman Catholic and so forth. These people are living in a world where their main means of existence are determined for them purely by secular mechanisms. I mean here things like free market economies, where the rules are made by liberal democracies, etc. That is, that their lives are not actually staked on, the existence of gods, never mind the miraculous workings of gods. Because the way we look at it in our modern world, religion is some kind of private, personal commitment. It's like one's personal relationship with a personal God, because that's how we think about gods. We basically banish them from everyday experience, shove them in some, different dimension of time and space, away from the actual fabrics and tissues of everyday life. And you can choose to believe in them or not. But, the stock market in New York is not interested in whether the God of the Catholics, the Protestants, the God of Hindus, God of the Jews is going to favor one stock over another. So what we call religion in our world is very, very, very different thing from what we generally call religion in non-modern contexts. In those contexts, people are staking their lives on these things. I mean, literally. And again, when one thinks of, just again, returning to the Greeks, the range of, as it were, life conditions which gods control. I mean, it's literally everything. It's whether the sun shines, whether the rain falls, whether the crops grow, whether babies are successfully born and reared and reach maturity to become adults. It's things like, sickness and health. It's things like victories on battlefields. Is your sea voyage going to be successful, or, are you going to have some disaster along the way? Literally everything. God's controlling. So these people are living in a world where they are not controlling the means of their own existence. In our modern world, whether we are good, I was raised as a Catholic, so I can speak with some authority here. Whether I'm a good Catholic or not, I don't presume for a moment that, the everyday life is here going to be controlled in any literal way by, the God of the Catholics. We tend to entrust all of that to the people who manage our societies, whether they're the politicians, the economists, all the people who make the big decisions about how the structures of our world operate. There isn't, at least in theory, there is no religious commitment at all involved in any of those structures. So our lives are not staked on religion as we know it today at all. But in the past, it's a completely different set of circumstances, as it were.
Well, perhaps it sounds from what you're saying that it might be more illustrative to perhaps describe how we are different from the societies of the past rather than going through one after another. But I think it would probably be particularly interesting to maybe describe examples like the Athenians, maybe a few others, ones that differ in certain ways, and then describe how we modern Westerners are so exotic and unusual in comparison to all of these.
Let me start with the modern world and how it is, as I would see it, completely unique in its let's call it metaphysical commitments. That is, in its the things on which it stakes life in terms of how they think about the foundations of reality. So I would say the first fundamental difference is this commitment that is at the heart of all modern scientific activity to a world that is ultimately material. That we can only accept the reality of something if it either is, as it were, a visible material thing in itself, like a person, a hill, a planet, or if it has some visible or observable material effects, things like gravity or wind or other phenomena. For example, atoms, which you can't literally see, but where you, obviously scientists routinely infer their existence from material traces. So there always has to be this kind of material component to something for it to be real. And so to a modern perspective, things like the goddess Athena, or for that matter, any kind of Christian version of God, are not real, because they're, to the modern secular mind, there is no materiality involved there. It is therefore a subjective product of the mind. And the second drastic difference between in non-modern contexts, there is a certain acceptance that humans cannot know everything, that there is always a mystery to existence. We might think of the Greeks as being, unusually sophisticated in their philosophy and so forth. But let's not forget that the philosophers in the Greek world are some tiny community of specialists who are actually critiquing what is the common sense of the time. These people are not the common sense of the Greeks. In other words, if you read a book of Greek philosophy, this is not what the Greeks thought. This is what individual Greeks thought in their critiques of what most Greeks thought. That's the way to think about Greek philosophy. But even there, even among some of those philosophers, there is a certain acceptance that there's a limit to what humans could ever possibly know. And of course, in our world, we don't accept that. At least in theory, I think many, if not most, if not all scientists believe that ultimately the entire universe is knowable, at least in theory. No other peoples in history have ever thought that. The reason we think it's knowable is because we think it's reducible to certain materialities, and materialities are always going to be eventually, somehow, if we can just develop the sophisticated enough devices to observe and measure, they will be observable. So that's the basic difference between our world and worlds lived by others, is this sense of a kind of material foundation to everything. Second is the human-centeredness of our world. Ultimately, in our world, to me, what secularism means is humans are not accountable to any forces or powers higher than themselves. It's not about whether you believe in bearded old guys, living up in the sky, this sort of thing. It's this sense of unaccountability. We're not answerable to any forces higher than ourselves. I mean, obviously, you look around the world right now and all these places burning, ice caps melting, sea levels rising. We ought to be bloody well answerable to some of these, whatever these forces are that are causing those things to happen. But we don't think of ourselves as being. And it's because we haven't thought about it in those terms for several hundred years now, at least in Western type societies, that maybe those things are happening, because what we've done has got so out of control that it has upset all of these delicate balances all over the world, such that the fabrics of the planet in their own way are telling us, we have absolutely crossed all of these lines and fractured these what were hitherto sustainable relations. We've kind of severed them, broken them, and things are starting now to change in a fundamental way. But it's because we don't regard ourselves as answerable to any forces higher than ourselves. Instead, we trust, the experts, whether they are physicists, whether they are economists, whoever they are, to basically tell us, how to live and what our world is made of, who we are, and so forth. Whereas all non-modern worlds, and I'll call them that because there are still people on our planet today who are living what I would call, to a point, their own distinctly different worlds of experience. And of course, I'm referring here to indigenous peoples primarily. So it's not like they've all gone and they've all vanished. There are still pockets of non-modern worlds being lived by peoples around the globe. So the human-centeredness of our world is something that completely sets it apart from all of these non-modern worlds. Of course, the secularism, our complete, the way we do not accept that we are answerable to forces higher than ourselves, and that we have to have relationships with those forces, which, as it were, might compel us to behave somewhat differently in our ways of life, in our way of life. And I'd say the final difference, so we've got materialism, let's call it anthropocentrism, that is human-centeredness. We've got secularism. And then the final one would be individualism, the way we think about how humans relate to one another. That we are all, just as the world is always materially reducible to tiny particles, so our social worlds are reducible to individuals. And we tend to think that maximal prosperity in a social situation is achievable when individuals are most enabled to maximize their own capacity to accumulate. So we tend to think of social good as being the sum of all individual goods. We don't tend to think of there being a social good that is actually separate from the goods of individuals, if you see what I mean. It's always, and again, you can see this in very mainstream conventional economic thinking. It's always about averages and aggregates. We really struggle to sort of think of a social good that is not just simply the sum of all individual goods. Again, this is something that wouldn't be at all strange to peoples of the past, because the way they conceive of relationships between human beings is fundamentally different. There's no such thing as a human individual in any other world other than a modern Western world. No such thing. It's not possible, because the way that they would think about it is, no human can survive by themselves. No human can live for oneself. At the very most basic level, one belongs always to a family. And one is trying to keep that family going, seeing it as a kind of little mini ecological unit. Whatever its basis of livelihood is, your job in life is to keep that going for the next generation. So you never exist for yourself. You never live just for yourself. You're always at a very fundamental level living for your family unit. And no family in a non-modern context will see itself as living in isolation from other families. They will always see themselves as being part of some larger community, some larger unit with which they have essential relations, without which they can't survive. And so you start to sort of expand it out from the family unit to larger communal units, all the way up to obviously some very substantial, let's call them societies or polities, whatever you want to call them, that we find in non-modern contexts. And so they are all, as it were, held together with these basic relations, which no one questions, no one doubts, and no one thinks they can live. What one person does affects everybody else. You harm the social body and you harm me, as it were. They can't think of themselves as being separate from that. To them, it would be unnatural to think of yourself as being separate from some body of people larger than yourself. Whereas in our world, it's the other way around. We tend to think that if we encourage all people as individuals to live as well as they possibly can, then society will ultimately benefit. They look at it from society first. They exist to serve society, whereas in our world, society exists to serve us as individuals. It's a fundamental kind of reversal of the logic. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. I think, again, thinking as the devil's advocate,
sure.
I think someone would probably want to probe you further on, if possible, describing the experience of reality of various ancient peoples, because we're talking about, as we mentioned in the very beginning, human participation in creating the reality that we experience. So how, if possible, could you describe the ways that an ancient experience of reality would be different from ours at a deeper level than just sort of the pattern of their lifestyle, and possibly make reference to modern indigenous contexts where these alternative experiences of a reality are still
Sure.
being lived to some degree?
I mean, as I said a little earlier, in a way, to me, people will always say, well, what you're talking about is just the world views of these people. You're not talking about something that we modern people would consider reality. We would consider literally a world. It is simply a world view. In other words, we're assuming the world is something that exists separate from them, and it's the way they see it, this thing that's separate from themselves. Because that's the way we think about it. Well, that's what to us, why our scientific way of knowing experience is superior is because we have this objectivity that we pride ourselves on. Our ability to see the world from outside as if we're these gods who can literally see it, without recognizing somehow that we are ourselves deeply implicated in the fabrics of any world that we're part of. The kind of mental gymnastics involved in sort of extricating ourselves from the entanglements of our everyday lives to seeing this world from outside. That's the sort of the modern perspective. So let's be clear that when a modern person says, well, that's just the ancient person's worldview, they're already presuming that there's only one way to think about all of this, and that's the modern way. So if you see what I'm saying, in a way, they've sort of set the trap for you. I would start out from the opposite perspective, which seems to me the much more normal one, as it were, which ought to be, but is not in our world, which is to accept that all humans, whether they're modern, non-modern, whoever the heck they are entangled in the fabrics of the world, whether they like it or not. They're only ever going to be able to know that world, as it were, from whatever location they are entangled in, as it were. And I think it's possible to see this at a very general level, in that there's, we could see our world today, that the assumptions about the world are somewhat different in the different locations around the world. Sure, we have the purest form of modern thinking, if you like, going on in places like America and Western Europe. In other parts of the world, we see the encroachment of some kinds of modern thinking, kind of still combined in a sort of hybrid-y way with some of the more, as it were, traditional kinds of thinking associated with that particular part of the world. How one knows the world one is in is always going to be shaped by, to a pretty significant extent, by the location in which one finds oneself. In other words, if one's brought up in a world which is founded on modern science and all of the beliefs that go with that about the possibility of objective knowledge, etc., then, that is what the location in which one is entangled. Of course, one's going to look at it that way. But that's just one of, literally many thousands of different ways of knowing experience. The more common way in history is that people accept that they are entangled. They are just threads in the fibers of being. They are not able to step outside it and see it from outside as some objective truth. And so, in other words, knowing experience is going to be about knowing how one is related to everything else in one's environment. In other words, one knows through actually living these things what works and what doesn't work. And this is what I would come back to. To me, in a way, the ultimate, if you like, what to me clinches the idea that we can speak of distinct worlds, not just world views in the past, is that these worlds worked on a fundamental level. As I said before about the Greeks, their ritual lives, which we could say existed in some form consistently for 2,500 years until they were outlawed by the Romans. This was a major part of their larger way of life. You know, they give their offerings to the goddess of fertility, let's say Demeter, and year after year, crops grow. Year after year, you know, human females are fertile and give birth to children. Where there is there going to be some, you know, some reason to come along and say, well, no, sorry, that's wrong. That's just your worldview. That's not what's really happening at all. And then you look at contrast that with our world, where we think we have all the answers and we know everything so much better than these people of the past did. And you look at the absolutely catastrophic things that are going on in our world right now. And we have to say that our way of thinking about this objective way of ours, where we're, as it were, trying to separate ourselves from the fabrics of the world, and we're elevating humans above all non-human phenomena, where we're not answerable to any forces higher than ourselves. And moreover, where even as humans, we are atomizing ourselves as individuals, all, as it were, preparing all of us to go off and seek our own personal fortunes, to fight and compete with one another. Well, you know, what's going to be the result of that? The result of that is 26 human individuals now own as much wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion inhabitants of our planet. Is that a world we really want? Is this the scientifically true world? Is this what living by ultimate truths of science gets us to? That our ice caps are melting, that the sea levels are rising, that there are fires all around, all over Australia, all over right now in the west coast of the United States, all over, you know, Greece, Italy, Turkey, the Mediterranean. I mean, at what point are we going to start to question this kind of hubristic assumption that we know better, that we have all of the answers, that we have our true, as it were, fingers on reality? No one is saying for a moment that modern science hasn't produced useful knowledge. No one is saying that. I'm not saying that at all. But I am questioning whether it has ultimately arrived at some kind of ultimate understanding of reality, which means we can dismiss all of the other realities that all other peoples in human experience, in human history, have lived. Because if we look at all of those other realities, none of them have caused the catastrophic damage to the world that our reality has effectively, we could say, however directly or indirectly, caused. Because it's building a way of life on the basis of those reality principles. That is where we're all these competitive individuals, where we're not answerable to forces higher than ourselves, where we think ourselves entitled to use the fabrics of our environment however we want, because humans are more significant than everything else. And where ultimately it's all just a bunch of matter. It all comes down to materiality. And even what's worthwhile in life is really just material things, whether it's money or possessions and so forth. I mean, I don't think it's too hard to see a pretty direct causal line between those kind of assumptions about what reality is made of and the current fortunes of our planet. So if you want a kind of an ultimate argument, an ultimate case made for the, you know, multiple different worlds of experience, I would put to you the, if you like, the ecological case. How well do these things work in practice? You know, we could say that the Greek model worked for them just fine for 2,500 years. And even after the Romans come along, and even after the Romans insist on Christianity, there are still some elements of their lives that remain, you know, broadly similar. Wasn't completely changed. And then, you know, you look at indigenous peoples, whether we're looking at the northern, Australia has still, you know, substantial populations here. Obviously, some of them have been assimilated into what we might call, you know, the modern style Australian society, but others, and my sense is increasingly in the homelands, as it were, the lands that the Australian state still permits indigenous peoples to live in, they are increasingly claiming a certain autonomy. They want to live it's not just about sort of a cultural preservation. It is essentially to live the world of one's ancestors, to live essentially in the reality of their ancestors. And I think, it's important for us to understand that this really is not just about sort of symbols and cultural stuff. This is about a distinct reality. And you can see similar, struggles going on all over the world now, where more and more, I think, Indigenous movements and communities, activists are emboldened to really, stake their claim to being able, their right, as it were, to live in a world of their own choosing. One that doesn't have to worry about all of the, the forces of modern capitalism and so forth. And you can see, at least I think anyone ought to be able to see it at some basic level, why that, where that comes from. It's that, these ways of their ancestors, they worked for them for centuries. I mean, as long as anyone can remember. And who are we to tell them that they have to live otherwise, that, they have to think of themselves as individuals, that they have to participate in a modern free market economy, they have to turn their motherland or fatherland or whatever it is into abstract property, which they then have to sell, or they then have to make productive in some modern economistic kind of a way, that none of their ancestral spirits or their gods are real, because, modern science just won't allow it.
So have you noticed a similar trend, I suppose, beyond Indigenous movements, like in larger so-called historically civilized parts of the world, but non-Western,
you mean
obviously?
where people who are, as it were, brought up and socialized in a let's call it a modern context, educated in a modern way, go to modern universities and so forth, where they are interested in the possibility of what we might call a pluriverse of worlds, rather than a single universal world where the rules are set by modern techno-scientific thinking. Sure, yeah, absolutely. Now, to a point, I think a lot of this is still somewhat in academic circles, but it has there are activists out there. I mean, to a point, you could see it in a lot of the movement towards more kind of local based living, the way people think of it as a kind of more authentic way. To me, if we have to boil it all down to a fundamental difference between the modern way and non-modern ways, it's about the way we think about relations. A modern reality is really not interested in relations, it's interested in things, whether the things are people, whether the things are, property, profits, and so forth. Whereas non-modern situations, it's always about maintaining relations. And you do sense among certain kinds of activists in these modern situations a yearning for more, as it were, meaningful relations, where they can, to a point, begin to stake their lives on more meaningful, closer relations with their more immediate environments. So that's in a general sense, yes, there. Now, how they're going to, as it were, conceptualize the way they relate to those environments. I mean, I would say if one's still talking in terms of, well, we need to live more in harmony with nature, what that does is still to preserve a sense of fundamental separation between humans and nature in the first place, which is that distinctly modern way of thinking. That's the kind of thing we have to get over, I think. We have to see ourselves fundamentally as being products of all the relations that make our lives possible. Whether these are human relations, the relations with our families, with the people who teach us, the people who socialize us, and all of the, incredible workers all over the world now who make our lives possible. Because if you think about all of the things that your everyday life depends on, all of the products, never mind all of the knowledge that you have to get through your everyday life, you start to think of all the relationships which have made you as you are now possible. whether they are relations of, son and parents, brothers and sisters, going back to grandparents, ancestors going back ages who chose to live where they did, which means that you live where you do. But then on a more immediate everyday level, all of the products you use, who's making these things? Where are they making them? What are the fabrics they're making them from? We have no idea, basically, in most cases. There's no names that come when you buy a computer. You don't get the name on there of the various people who made this thing. Never mind getting a sense of where all the parts were sourced from. What original materials are they coming from? Which parts of the world? We have vague senses of these things, but not much.
Well, you mentioned briefly connections to family and ultimately to ancestors. The specific example I had in mind was modern East Asian societies, like China, obviously being the main one, in which in pre-modern history, society, from what I understand, revolved around essentially veneration of the ancestors. Is that something that you think could that once again conceivably become the dominant concern of the state in somewhere like China?
I think it's something that probably ought to become, some sense of one's. I'm not saying you need to have, Chinese style ancestor cults or anything like that, but there could be practices developed which heighten one's sense of one's interconnection with others, including, of course, one's own ancestors. And as it currently stands, in sort of modern context, the way one thinks about it is, if ancestors did things one is proud of, then one is happy to celebrate one's relations with them. If the ancestors did things one is not proud of, one wants to distance oneself as much as possible. To me, I don't want to make this too, maybe I should. You take a settler colonial situations like Australia, like the United States. To me, I've lived in the United States for 30 years now. It is staggering to me how marginalized Indigenous people in the United States are. They are literally ignored by most people most of the time. And of course, again, many have assimilated into, modern US cities. But there are, of course, still communities living in their specially designated areas that the government has allowed them to live in, which are, of course, tiny little portions of what their original homeland was, or in some cases, totally separate from what their original homeland was. The idea that there needs to be some kind of reconciliation here, some kind of recognition of what one's settler colonialist ancestors have done here to cause this current situation. This, is a matter of, I would say, great urgency. You could say in the United States, the confronting the legacy of slavery, people maybe are now finally beginning to really get to grips with that, to a point. Of course, there's still resistance to it, with talk of reparations and so forth. But even there's still a long way to go. But I would say that the conversation has barely started when it comes to Indigenous peoples and what the legacy of settler colonialism there. So for the descendants of the white Europeans who came here and who were responsible for initially carving out all of his territory and taking it over and so forth, that is an ancestral legacy that needs to be confronted. So it isn't all about celebrating one's ancestors. I think there are many, many contexts in the world where, Europeans have completely destroyed the fabrics of the non-modern world into which they unleash themselves, where there needs to be more confrontation of these legacies. And it should, if it takes ancestral thinking to do that, then so be it. But that might be a certain kinds of practices which heighten our sense of connection with what's been done in the past. Not to say it need all be negative, but where it was negative, it needs to be recognized. So yes, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's more of a more general sense of, continuity. The one is just the kind of temporary face, as it were, of some kind of family continuum that passes through history. That we are not these, as we're taught to think of ourselves as being, these kind of unique individuals who live for ourselves, die for ourselves, and then, that's it. I mean, I think part of the reason why the modern Western style societies have such a hard time dealing with death is because that's how we think of ourselves, is as these momentary beings who, are born to live for ourselves, and then die. And guess what? That's it. It's all over. Whereas if you live in a world where you're not living ultimately for yourself, but you're living for your family unit, for some social unit, cultural unit larger than yourself, you have that constant sort of consolation of that. It's not all about you. It's about these larger entities. And so if we think of it in those terms, maybe then death will not be such a terrifying proposition at the end of literally everything, because you'll see that whatever it was that you contributed to the fabrics of those, whether it's family units, social units, whatever other kinds of relationships that you participated in and contributed to, that they will outlive you. They will carry on. And so you will continue to have some kind of a life. And I mean, the Chinese are far from unique in having this sense of, the venerating ancestors, let's say venerating. I mean, this is actually, again, almost a culture universal. Again, the modern world is kind of unique in not doing so, I would say. We are very selective about the ancestors we venerate, and we don't routinely do so. And I think that's, it's not just a shame, because for us personally, it's, we ought to feel some sense of continuity with the past and continuity into the future. But it's also a necessary thing we do. So, the sins of the past, as it were, can finally be confronted, and there can be finally some accounting. Some people taking responsibility for all of these horrors that have been committed in the past.
Mm. I suppose it's very easy to see that the time is getting away from us, but I suppose someone listening and watching who very much feels the kind of alienation of the modern world that you've described and would like to have some idea of how it would be to experience the world as most humans have throughout history, how might they, on an individual level, go about doing that, do you think?
I mean, I don't know that it is possible on just a pure individual level. Again, I think that's part of what we have to get over and get past, is this thinking that, it is ultimately about us as individuals. It's not. It's about relations. It's about relations between humans and relations between humans and non-humans. However, we are conceptualizing those non-humans. It's very clear that in the world that, non-humans are going to have a say in our world, whether we like it or not. They've been having a say in all manner of different ways since the beginning of time, long before humans were around. And obviously, if they, whether it's things like making crops grow, making the rain fall, making the sun shine, rivers flowing, fish, animals, whatever it is, I mean, this is all happening. Non-humans are doing things all around us. It's about cultivating relations with all of that vast realm of non-humanity that are far more, let's say, responsible and humane than the relationships we currently have with them, which you could say are almost not relationships at all. It's like, if we're allowed to do what the hell we like with all of it, then that is no kind of relationship. So I'm a historian. I'm not going to pretend that I'm some kind of, prophet or for the future and sort of lay out some grand blueprint for some future utopia where things could be otherwise. What I would just lay down is maybe a few general points of principle, which is it's about the life-sustaining practices that we develop. What kind of a world do those practices take for granted? If those practices take for granted a world where humans can do whatever the hell they like, because they are superior to everything non-human, then those practices are likely to result in the kinds of catastrophic damage that we see. What we need are practices which don't think in those terms. You can see that there's a start in this direction already, you could say, when, let's say, New Zealand, for example, granting things like rights to rivers, treating rivers as if they are persons with rights. Now, I would say, well, that's a start, but we maybe need to go further than that, because if you're treating a river as a person with rights, you're treating that river as an individual and as a modern style liberal individual, as it were. And I think that's what we have to get past. What we want is a world where you don't need rights to protect yourself against, some whatever the forces are that rights protect us against. Again, rights are a modern construct where they were developed in a time of absolute rulers, the absolute monarchs of Western Europe in the early modern age, where individuals felt they needed that sort of protection. And of course, in our modern world, yeah, sure, we need rights. But if we're moving to transitioning to some other kind of a world that is not, as it were, modern in its essential fabrics, let's try to get beyond needing rights to protect ourselves. Rather, what we need is relations. Productive, humane, responsible relations with other humans and with non-human phenomena all around us, however we conceive of them. And we have to kind of bake those relations into whatever practices we devise, which is coming back to what we were saying earlier about the sort of the local level on which this can occur, where if let's say the food you're eating is locally sourced, locally produced, you might start to have more of a sense of your interconnection, one's interconnection with a local ecology, as it were, than if all the food you're eating is produced by, faceless human individuals who are slaughtering faceless animals in, horrific slaughterhouses away from the public eye. That we have no idea who these animals were, who the human slaughterers are, who the human processors are. It's all so utterly depersonalized. How can one have a sense of interconnection, interrelatedness, if anything, if the basic food we're eating is produced in these ways? If one has a sense of, the relatedness between the humans who produce the food, the land that they produce it on, etc., that's going into us to make us physically who we are at any given time. I mean, these are the kinds of interconnections that non-modern people took for granted, that we obviously don't have anymore, because the actual relations that are making our lives possible now are so anonymized and so scattered all over the globe that we really have no sense of, it's hard to develop that sense of essential interconnection, interrelation on which one's life depends, that all of non-modern peoples took for granted. So develop practices which presume a sense of interrelatedness. At the very least, they may name the people who produce things. So you have a sense of the people who made things for you that help make your life what it is and help make you who you are. To have more of a sense of the continuities of things across time between generations. So to develop practices along those lines. Again, I'm not smart enough or far-sighted enough to develop like specific propositions about specific practices, but those are the general lines on which I would suggest. And if you're going to have practices along those lines, you will effectively be enacting a different world, because you'll be enacting a world where those relations become the meaningful things in the world, not just the isolated, individuated things that make up the world we currently live in today. It starts to become a world of relations, a world made of relations. And this is why, where the realness of it comes from. Your life is made possible by these things. You live and you die, and if the world is able to sustain your life in some way, as you hope it and expect that it will, what is more real than that? So right now, our modern practices are making life at least unsustainable for future human beings, if not for present ones, obviously for many present ones too. I don't know if the ultimate criteria for realness should be, livability, sustainability, ecological responsibility, not some objective, modern, peculiarly modern idea of truth, abstract idea of truth. That's what I would say. And if we redefine realness in those kind of terms, then we start to see not only that humans have lived in many different real worlds in the past that sustain themselves in what we might call ecologically responsible ways for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Those things were every bit as real as our world and far less damaging. Mm. Does that make sense to you, Sam?
Absolutely. I think a great many people, I mean, speaking for myself in particular, what makes this approach to history particularly interesting is the relevance it has to right now.
Yes.
And people, modern people, going about their own daily lives. So for someone interested in delving deeper into the topic, where should they go? What kind of material should they consult?
Oh, yes. I mean, I should be absolutely clear that it's not like I'm some isolated voice here. Within the world of history, there may not be so many people talking in these kinds of terms who are willing to take seriously the possibility of, a pluriverse of worlds. I think people will come around to this idea more and more. I certainly hope that they do. In anthropology, there's been a lot of work along these kinds of lines already in particularly the last 15, 20 years. Do you want me to name particular authors who are worth reading,
who
will
certainly
expand your mind? Okay, well, let's start with, in terms of relations between humans and non-humans, I would say great authors to read. First of all, Donna Haraway. She is, in a way, one of the pioneers of this sort of way of thinking. She likes to talk in terms of, again, realities are things that are processes, they are not fixed and given, and that we need to think in terms of, as she would put it, she uses terms like multi-species becoming, as a meaning it's about how we, all species relate together. They have to see, as it were, life as a common enterprise, but across different species. So she would, she heightens our sense of the agency of non-human species, non-human beings. And she is just, a paradigm-shattering author who is just so interesting and so well worth reading. She taught for many years at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And a colleague of hers there is called Anna Tsing, Tsing. She's also writes very interestingly along very similar lines. She wrote a wonderful book about mushrooms and mushrooms surviving and producing, in a way, their own distinct worlds of experience in which humans participate, sort of in the margins of this capitalist world that has sort of gradually taken over and monopolized the planet. How alternative mushroom, as it were, centered worlds have sprung up despite the capitalist world attempt to control and exhaust everything. So again, a fascinating thinker. And of thinking of a different kind, if you're interested in anthropological thinking and just the sheer range of different, as it were, models of the world, models of reality that different communities have lived by, read a work called Beyond Nature and Culture by Philippe Descola, Descola. He is a French anthropologist, but it's translated into English, and he will give you this vast panorama of different ways of being in the world that different communities have lived by. It's a fairly academic book, but still very accessible to any, I'd say, thinking, interested person. And then the decolonial thinking, people who have been heavily influenced by the indigenous struggles we talked about earlier. That is, that they are essentially not only supporting those struggles to resist the encroachment of capitalist developmentalism, growthism into these worlds that are still somehow surviving and being maintained by indigenous peoples, but taking seriously the possibility that the principles on which those indigenous worlds exist can have, maybe broader application. Maybe even that people living in what we would call modern societies today could start to reimagine their worlds on these different lines, again, ultimately along relational lines. The important authors here would be Arturo Escobar, Escobar. His best known book is called Designs for the Pluriverse, which is, I very crudely described the kind of thinking that is in his book already. So he's someone I would encourage. And if you want to see get a broader sense of, as it were, the full horror of modern experience as seen from maybe a sort of indigenous influence perspective, Walter Mignolo, Mignolo, has written a series of volumes on this, one of which is called The Darker Side of Modernity. And it is a very dark side indeed when you start to see it from that kind of perspective. So there's just a few names of people I would encourage to read, all of whom would be broadly in favor of this more, let's call it, pluriversal way of thinking about experience.
Well, I've no doubt that we could continue speaking for many more hours. It's just, such a broad sweep of human experience that it covers and crosses so many different disciplines. It's like,
I think it has to, though, because the divisions between the disciplines are part of our larger compartmentalization of experience that we talked about earlier. That's fundamentally the modern way. We think we can only truly understand something if we break it down to its smallest essences. But in so doing, we lose a sense of the relationality which makes the thing what it is in the first place. And I think, sadly, the academic world reproduces this division of experience by shoving us all off into different specialist disciplines, thinking that we all truly know what goes on in our discipline. Well, no, I think we lose a sense of the broader interconnectedness, the interrelatedness of everything when we do that. So in a way, I've had to unlearn being a specialist historian in order to be able to think, as it were, along these broader relational pluriversal kinds of lines. And much as it's against my own professional interest to do so, I would encourage everyone to think in these, let's say, post-disciplinary ways where we're not, packaging knowledge into little packages. Instead, we're starting to see how, more how things connect together. If we can have a more interrelated, more interconnected body of knowledge there, then we can start to live more interconnected, more interrelated lives. I believe, I hope, before it's too late.
Yes, well, there's still time, we're told. Yeah.
We're told, yes.
But I think for now we may have to leave it there. So I'll just say goodbye to you, but I won't hang up on you after I stop recording, just so you know. So yeah, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And yeah, thank you so much for making the time to speak at length on it.
Thank you for listening, Sam, and being such a good listener. And thank you for inviting me in the first place.
Thank you.